So the move to the second talk, and it's going to be given by Gagandeep Kang, and she has been working in India for a long time, but recently decided to join the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I think she will tell more about what she has done, what she plans to do.
Right. So the challenge to everybody is to get my name right. Gagandeep. But also Cherry, which might be a bit simpler. So I'm going to be talking to you about enhancing vaccine equity before, during, and after the pandemic. The outline of my talk is to consider vaccination as a public good and vaccine equity, and then go through examples of how we thought about equity from a developing country perspective. So even though I'm at the foundation now, I'm really going to be talking about the experience from India. So if we think about vaccination as a public good, this is the triple billion target that was established by WHO a few years ago. The idea was about reaching more people, improving care and protection, both through routine immunization as well as during pandemics. And this target was established understanding that place and circumstance of our birth actually predicts where we will go in life. So if we think about vaccines, we've always thought about vaccines as preventing disease, but there is a lot of interest now in thinking about the full value of vaccines. So what happens if people don't get sick? What does it mean for them, for their families, for society in general? And this is not even considering what vaccines could do for AMR, for national health security, what it means for a country to have vaccine manufacturing capacity. So when we think about vaccines, mostly our approaches have been to look at the prevention of disease. But if you think about child survival, the fact that kids stay in school, that parents don't need to take time off, you can understand that there are a lot of knock-on effects. So having vaccines as soon as they become available is really important for a society. But that doesn't happen very easily. So shown here on this slide is when vaccines were introduced in the UK, diphtheria in 1942, pertussis in 1957, measles in 1968, and then you see how much those vaccines reduced disease. A bad vaccine like pertussis, 96% reduction in disease. Now look at when these vaccines actually came into India. In India, the EPI program was established in the late 1970s, so 20 to 30 years behind the UK. The measles vaccine came in 1986, and then for routine immunization, we had no new vaccines until 2009, when we got Hib as part of the pentavalent vaccine. And pneumococcal vaccines, which came into the UK in 2006, India ramped that up only in 2020. So as you can see, 1 or 2 decades in how long it takes for a relatively poor country to introduce new vaccines. Now that's about the country as a whole. But if you look at within a country, there are always rich people in the country. And I don't expect you to see all the figures here, but this is the immunization schedule that is recommended by the Indian Academy of Pediatrics. So private companies bring vaccines into the country. So if you can afford to pay for vaccination for your child, they will probably receive almost the same vaccines that a child in the UK or the US or Australia would get. But poor kids only get the first 6 lines or the first 6 rows, because that's all that the country can afford to give. Just as a sense of context, India has 26 million children born every year, so you can imagine that for the government, introducing a new vaccine into the program is not a decision lightly taken. So we know that not just in India, but everywhere in the world, unimmunized and under-immunized children really come from deprivation. So if you look at kids in LMICs, about 8% of them before the pandemic were 0 dose, received no vaccines. And of the ones that were 0 dose, about a quarter of them belonged to the poorest wealth quintiles, had mothers who had no education, and about 2/3 lived in rural areas. So WHO has now started to look at intra-country differences. In this map, the redder you are, the greater the difference between the richest and the poorest in terms of vaccine coverage. Now, that is for routine immunization. But if we look at COVID-19 vaccines, 13.5 billion doses given, 70% of the world getting 1 dose of COVID-19 vaccine, but only 1/3 of people in low-income countries having received 1 dose as of our World in Data day before yesterday. So when we think at a country level, how do you decide when to introduce a vaccine? First, you need to know you have the disease, you need to have a vaccine, and the health system has to be ready to deliver that vaccine. Now, that's for routine immunization. But if you have a pandemic or you have outbreaks, then the considerations do change, and you can have an emergency response where you now give vaccines to people and populations who would not receive it from a routine immunization program. So coming now to a story that is equity before the pandemic. Rotaviruses are very familiar to pediatricians, or used to be familiar to pediatricians, because group A rotaviruses were the most common cause of dehydrating gastroenteritis in children globally. Then in 2006, we got vaccines. But if you look at this figure from 2019, the percentage of deaths among children that were attributable to diarrhea, not rotavirus, the redder you are, the worse off you are. If you're dark blue, you're good. So you can see that the burden really resides in the tropical belt and is worst in sub-Saharan Africa. In India, 6.6% of all under 5 deaths are still attributed to diarrhea in 2019. The first vaccine for rotavirus was RotaShield. There were efforts to develop new vaccines from the 1970s onwards. Many of them were based on human strains, many were based on animal strains, but it wasn't until 1998 that we got our first vaccine, and this was a rhesus and human virus reassortant vaccine developed at the NIH. 3 doses of this vaccine were given orally at 2, 4, and 6 months, and this vaccine had a side effect, very relevant since we just spoke about adenovirus vectored vaccines. So the argument then was made that, this was a vaccine that was introduced in the US. In the US, intussusception is an unacceptable side effect. So you need to have a safer vaccine. If you looked at risk and benefit in low and middle income countries, it was felt that the vaccine would still save many more lives than would be lost because of intussusception. It was a relatively rare side effect. that it was also felt that there was a political dimension to this, in that if you don't use a vaccine for American children, how could you possibly distribute this vaccine for children in poorer countries in Asia or in Africa? So fortunately for the rotavirus field, GSK and Merck kept going, and in 2006, we had 2 new vaccines licensed. They were tested in very large numbers of infants to be able to detect a signal of intussusception that was similar to that of RotaShield. When these vaccines were introduced, the cost of the vaccines was $200 for a course. 2 vaccines or 3 vaccines. They became available in India just 2 years later, and they cost only about $30 at the time in India for a dose. Now, $30 is more than our immunization program spends on any child in a year. The average was about $5 for a fully immunized child in India. So there was no way the country was going to spend this much money on immunizing 26 million children. I did a back of the envelope calculation and figured out that if we were paying US prices for rotavirus vaccine for 1 birth cohort in India, we would wipe out our entire health budget. So just wasn't going to work. We'd been working on building the case for introducing rotavirus vaccines, and pediatricians were anti the vaccine because they said diarrhea is a disease we can manage. The argument that we were making was that, well, you don't see the diarrhea that dies outside of your clinic. So we set up a surveillance system that was a national surveillance system and showed that about 2 out of every 5 children hospitalized for diarrhea in India had rotavirus. We did a number of community-based studies to actually build a burden of disease pyramid that showed that 1 out of every 650 children born in India at the time died of a rotavirus gastroenteritis. Not only that, for most of the children that wind up in the hospital, India has the highest out-of-pocket payment for healthcare. And if you had 1 child in the hospital for 3 days, that resulted in a loss of 5% of the annual income for the family. So there was no question that there was a burden. To cut a very long story and 10 years of my life short, we worked on a rotavirus vaccine that was based on a strain that was identified in India. We worked with a company called Bharat Biotech and conducted phase 1, 2, and 3 studies. The vaccine was licensed ultimately in 2014, and it was the first vaccine, rotavirus vaccine, to be priced at $1 a dose. That vaccine now costs about 60 cents a dose. In 2016, we were able to persuade the government to introduce the vaccine into the national program. In India, nothing gets introduced overnight for all children. It has to be a phased introduction. So we did the introduction, and by the end of 2019, the vaccine was all over the country. We then have been doing impact assessment studies because we know oral rotavirus vaccines don't work very well in low and middle income countries, and we were able to demonstrate impact. After the vaccine was introduced, the winter peaks of rotavirus were significantly blunted, and this is a finding that has been maintained. Now, that's the Indian birth cohort, but I tell this story because these vaccines are now going global. You see the light blue in the center of Africa? That's Indian vaccines being used in Africa now. So Merck has withdrawn from the Gavi market. GSK provides limited supply. So the Indian companies are now coming in and delivering vaccines to places that need them and delivering it at a cost that's significantly less than that of the multinational manufacturers. The problem, of course, is one of price and volume and access, but to the researchers in the room, I'd like to point out the inequity in vaccine performance. So if you look at the forest plot there, the red line shows you the performance of the vaccine in high-income countries, and the diamonds are how the vaccine performs in low-income countries. You can see the gap. 95% protection if you live in a high-income country, 50% or less protection if you live in a low-income country. The same thing is shown in the other figures there, where essentially vaccine effectiveness is plotted against GDP in the top graph. So if you're in a rich country, the vaccine works beautifully. If you're in a poor country, then the vaccine works less well. Or you can look at it by under 5 mortality. The greater the mortality, the worse the vaccine works. So we really need, when we think about equity, to also think about developing better vaccines or better strategies for vaccination. So I'll move from there to COVID-19 vaccines, and I'd like to take you back to March 2021, where these were the statements made by the People's Vaccine Network. Rich nations are vaccinating 1 person every second, while the majority of the poorest nations are yet to give a single dose. The message to the G20 leaders at the time, please share. Didn't happen for a long time. So this is a list of the first few vaccines that were approved by the WHO. Shown in black are the vaccines that went to high-income countries. Shown in red are the vaccines that went to low and middle-income countries. You can see there that most of the platforms, there were no mRNA vaccines that went to low-income countries unless it was a donation through the COVAX facility that was established by CEPI and the Gavi Alliance. Now, those vaccines came well after high-income countries had vaccinated their entire populations. WHO had made a case that all countries should try and vaccinate healthcare workers and the elderly, and then come to lower risk groups. But it was very clear from early on that the way politics was playing out, any political leader that said, let's give our vaccines away, was not going to be elected the next time around. So no leaders actually did that. In India, we gave out 2.2 billion doses of vaccine, and India imported no vaccines. It was also the country that had vaccines that were made on every platform possible. So the first one out the door was Covishield, which was the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca vaccine made in India. There was also Covaxin based on an Indian strain. It was an inactivated vaccine made by the same company that made the first rotavirus vaccine. We also had Covovax and J&J, shown here in red, are the vaccines that were WHO pre-qualified, and then several vaccines which were not WHO pre-qualified. Most of them came later and were not really used as much in the public system. But these vaccines cost between $5 and $12 a dose, significantly less than was paid in high-income countries. So it wasn't easy for India to do all of this. There wasn't experience with developing new vaccines. Clinical trials were always a problem. No well-established networks. Regulatory processes are an issue. With the AstraZeneca vaccine or Covishield, as you heard, there were some events of TTS. Those were not well documented by the vaccine safety monitoring system, so all kinds of issues. And then, of course, anti-vaccine lobbyists appeared in India much as they did in other parts of the world. But to me, the biggest question was, when do we get equity? When do we understand, are the vaccines working? Which vaccine worked the best? And unfortunately, if you look at where the world's vaccine effectiveness data came from, it really came from high-income countries. Now, again, I'm not going to expect you to read and see all of this. The red, across the top are the vaccines: AstraZeneca, Janssen, Moderna, Pfizer, and Sinovac, CoronaVac, which is the last on the left-hand side. So here what we have is across the top is severe disease. In the two boxed areas is symptomatic disease and any infection. What you see there is first dose, second dose, third dose. What it shows you is that all of the vaccines performed fairly similarly against any infection and symptomatic disease. Protection did not last very long and tended to wane. And if you gave booster doses, you got an increase in protection, but again, it waned quite rapidly. However, if you look across the top at severe disease, all of the vaccines performed very similarly. It didn't matter which platform you were looking at. Now, COVID-19 vaccines had the most rapid rollout in history. It is something that, as vaccinologists, we should be very proud of. It saved 20 million lives. It got us back to pretty functional status in about 12 to 18 months. But if the vaccines had been more equitably distributed, we could have saved another 600,000 people. So thinking about equity after the pandemic, what's the way forward? Well, one of the things that we learned during COVID was that the state of play has changed for India, for China, and for South Korea that are coming up as really major vaccine manufacturers. Earlier, the paradigm used to be high-income countries make the vaccine, low-income or low-middle-income countries use that platform and make a copycat vaccine. And the regulator only has to approve the immunogenicity and registration of that vaccine, and then it gets used. But what's happening now is we've actually moved into doing preclinical and all of the clinical phases of testing. We haven't gotten to discovery yet, but I can see that happening as well. Manufacturing capacity in developing countries now is humongous, and they have built in. During the pandemic, we had lots of issues with quality of manufacturing, and many of the companies in L and MICs are addressing those issues now. I think everybody's recognized the importance of regional manufacturing. There is a big push to put manufacturing in Africa. There are issues associated with that we will have to deal with, because setting up a manufacturing facility for vaccines and maintaining it is no easy task, no matter what rhetoric we bring to the table about self-reliance. So if we think about the immunization agenda 2030, everyone, everywhere, at every age, fully benefits from vaccines for good health and well-being. I can't think of a better description for vaccine equity. But I'd just like to leave you with a couple of thoughts. One of them is, let's compare COVID-19 and TB. We've known TB for a really, really long time, and we still don't have a good vaccine for TB. If we can take all of the science that we have developed, focused on during COVID-19, bring more people together, is it so crazy to think that this might be a problem that we can address better than we are doing today? So I don't know if, my last slide didn't come up, but my last slide is the Sustainable Development Goals. Immunization actually contributes to 14 out of the 17 SDGs. If we really want a sustainable world, vaccines have to be a part of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Beautiful talk and beautiful story. Let's see. Plenty of questions. We can start.
Thank you for that excellent talk. So, public health and global health doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It is reflective of larger socio-political trends. It does not drive socio-political trends. So, vaccine nationalism is reflective of a wave of nationalism. Vaccine inequity is reflective of broader inequities. So my question is, where is the responsibility? Who is it incumbent upon to make these changes? Because there seem to be they're reflective of a much broader trend. So is it, and we can say sort of everybody has to be involved, but realistically, where does it start?
So I've actually thought about this a fair bit. In high-income countries, science drives interventions in health. In low-income countries, it's champions who find the right time to be able to push an agenda. So change can come slowly if you wait for the science. If you want to progress something faster, you have to build the champions.
Yeah, thank you for the beautiful presentation. After rotavirus vaccine was introduced in Africa, and this study by Wale and the other colleagues showed that they have just about 50% effectiveness, vaccine effectiveness. I was thinking that possibly maybe there's a need for maybe an indigenous vaccine. But when you talked about the one you actually got in in India, I know that India is one of the fastest growing country, but it's also a developing, nation, but it's also still taken as a developing nation. And you still find out that the rotavirus vaccine that you produced in India still had just about 50% efficacy. If I may ask, what do you think is responsible for the low vaccine efficacy in developing countries, and what can be done?
So one of the things that we thought about was the fact that the gut environment is very different in low and middle income countries. You have a lot more inflammation, you have a lot less surface area, and we don't know how much of a role the maternal environment plays in determining what the gut of a child looks like. I think it's not going to be one thing, it's going to be multiple things, and not all of them are fixable. So one of the strategies we're thinking about now is, if you give a neonatal dose before enteropathy develops in the gut, will you actually wind up with a better response to vaccines? It's an experiment that we're just starting on.
Okay, thank you.
Vale?
Sherry, thank you so much for that very beautiful talk, highlighting the many dimensions of vaccine equity. I'd like to ask you about two of them. First, you highlighted the differences in vaccine efficacy in certain regions of the low-income countries compared to high-income countries. Despite the fact that this has been known for decades, it seems to me there hasn't been a concerted effort to address this. There are ad hoc efforts here and there, but this hasn't really been brought into the main focus of how vaccines are tested. So my question to you is, what is a country like India, which has enormous capacity, enormous talent, doing to address this issue?
Very little.
Yes. And why is that? And what could be done to make it more active?
Well, actually, because there aren't large-scale science programs in India, Indian funding for research is much better than in many other low and middle income countries, but it's still short term. You can never get a grant more than 3 years, and they tend to be small grants. And clinical research has not been emphasized.
Yeah.
So much of the research that we do comes from international funding.
So it seems to me that this is an opportunity for someone like CEPI to fund programs that brings together scientists in the Western countries and scientists in institutions in India to address this very critical issue, right?
CEPI is focused on epidemics and pandemics. This is endemic disease.
Yes, yes.
Maybe it's the Gates Foundation.
Maybe the Gates, yeah. Just a quick follow-up question. You've also shown the incredible capacity of Bharat Biotech and other companies to make vaccines, and make vaccines that, Western pharma wouldn't necessarily be interested in. How could the rest of the world take advantage of this capacity, and what are the impediments for Bharat Biotech to import their vaccines to other countries in the West? Is there a political impediment, sociological impediment?
None. So in fact, one of the biggest success stories is Serum Institute of India making a meningitis vaccine that essentially wiped out many from sub-Saharan Africa. So absolutely can be done.
Very nice talk for addressing this real public health issue. So my question is, do you think if pandemic happens again next year, these things will be repeated in terms of acuity? The reason I'm telling, even in US or Europe or UK, when people were waiting for and the manufacturing capacity was at the fullest, people were waiting in line for weeks for getting the Moderna vaccine. So if you are not strong, how we are going to help others?
So one of the things that is an interesting approach that has come out of the experience of the pandemic is to put manufacturing capacity in countries that have small populations, so that the country's own needs can be met quite quickly, and then there is vaccine available for other places. It's an imperfect solution, but it is one.
So very insightful talk, actually. So according to the data, if we are talking about the efficacy of the vaccine, the efficacy is low for the vaccine developed by India or like the Bharat Biotech. Technically, it should be, if it's developed by a country, the indigenous vaccine should have much better efficacy compared to the other ones. Why so the efficacy? Is this the monitoring challenge or?
No, it's actually the environment in which the vaccine is used makes a difference, not where it's made. The Merck and the GSK vaccines, when they were taken to Africa, they also showed about 50% efficacy.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I have a question with regards to the clinical development and particular clinical trials, running clinical trials in low and middle income countries. In Western countries, there's actually a crisis in recruitment of vaccinees for vaccine clinical trial development. It's becoming very, very hard. And at the same time, as you've shown, many of our vaccines are not tested in low and middle income countries. So could there be a situation where the demand and the supply might join, and this might help building an environment of clinical research in low and middle income countries?
Well, we're trying to build that capacity. So 2 of the COVID-19 vaccines actually had phase 3 trials with about 60,000 participants, and they were able to recruit quite quickly. But when people are scared of a disease, they're more likely to volunteer for a vaccine trial. If it's a more endemic disease, then the likelihood is lower. But in general, we are trying to change the environment so that we can do more clinical research where it is relevant. So live in hope.
Well, thank you. Well, I got a question for you. In addition to vaccine distribution, at the end of the pandemic, there were there's still a lot of people now vaccinated, but basically Gavi decided not to get vaccine anymore. Yeah. And what was the reason for that?
Well, the demand, at least from the COVAX facility, COVAX's commitment was to get 2 billion doses of vaccine distributed. They were slow, but they got up to 1.9 billion, and most of those doses have been distributed. After that, there is no demand, not even for boosters. So primary series, whoever was going to get it, got it. And it's very difficult now to get boosters out.
Is a question of infrastructure to vaccinate adults or
well,
elderly?
I also think that you need for policy to keep pace with the changing picture. The policies for boosters were before Omicron. So post-Omicron, it's been a little bit more difficult. You also now don't have companies in LMICs that are making boosters, right? That are bivalent boosters. Everything's still based on Wuhan, except for a couple of small suppliers. So.
Well, thank you.